and welcome to my latest video. So this is going to be another video for the Leviathan box that Games Workshop sent me. In the previous video I looked at the Terminator, how to paint it as a Deathwing Terminator from the Space Marine range, and in this video I'm going to be painting one of the Tyranids, and this is a Neurogaunt, I think it is. So you can see the models are already stuck together and primed, so it's all ready to go. One thing I will say about this, and this is actually true for all the models from the Leviathan boxes, they're all push fit. And that means that they're made of much fewer pieces than normal models. They're very quick and easy to put together, so you can get straight down to gaming, but it's actually a little bit harder to get them for painting, because you can't make sub-assemblies very easily, especially because the where they push fit, you do have to tend to fill those gaps around on them. So for this model, because the arms and legs are very close together, it's quite hard to paint the underside. On the plus to that though, no one really turns the model upside down to look at the underside, so you don't have to spend too much time on that. So just things like the base colours will be fine for painting the underside. If you look on the wet palette there in the top left, so you can see there's quite a few colours there. It looks very colourful, and the colours are a bit misleading. So a lot of the colours here are going to be working as sort of base colours to give subtleties to the model, and by the time I've actually finished with it, it's going to be not quite as colourful as the palette suggests, but those colours will still be there, but they'll be a little bit more subtle than that. Just to go through the colours, quite a few of these are mixed. You don't have to worry too much about getting the exact colour ratios that I use, as long as it goes from like a dark to a light and the colours are roughly the same. The result will be very, very similar. So in the bottom left there, so we're starting with Xereus purple, and it has a small amount of Fire Dragon Bright mixed with it. So like I said, you don't have to be too precise with this, but what you'll find is like a very small amount of Fire Dragon Bright will make kind of a significant difference to the look of the colour, and that's the first colour that I'm using, covering all of the sort of the carapace, or like the bony exoskeleton parts of the model. Above that, it's the same mix again, but different ratios. So it's Xereus purple, Fire Dragon Bright, and above that again, I think you can kind of like you see as it gets lighter and lighter as it goes up. It's just the same thing, but just more Fire Dragon Bright each time. The colour in the top left is Ushabti bone. Then starting next line across at the bottom, that's Incubi Darkness, and then I just add white each time to that. You might want to do like one or two more transitions for that actually, and you can see I'm just using the Incubi Darkness on the model at the moment as well. One thing to mention with the Incubi Darkness going straight over the black primer is you're going to need probably 2 or 3 coats just to get like an opaque kind of finish on it. It doesn't have to be perfect because you will be highlighting up over it, so like inconsistencies in the finish can be sorted out later on, but you do kind of like want to be able to see the colour, so make sure you do like a couple of layers at least, just so you can see what's going on there. Also, while you're doing this, don't use a small brush. I know the model is very small, but just get a big brush and slap the paint on. It's going to be quicker, and even though the larger brush will give a slightly more translucent finish to the layer of paint when you apply it, you can very quickly cover the model with the larger brush. So I'm using a size 2 Artis Opus brush. It's a little bit worn out as well, so don't, for all kind of like base work and things like that, don't use brand new brushes with sharp tips, because you'll just end up wearing the tip off for something that doesn't need like finely detailed work on it. So after the Incubi Darkness, as I mentioned, you go up and you add a white each time on that. Then the next paint colour along, this is again Xereus purple at the bottom, but this time mixed with Emperor's Children. So at the bottom it's mostly Xereus purple with Emperor's Children, a small amount of Emperor's Children. Then as you can guess, you see as it goes further up, you add more Emperor's Children. However, at the very top, that is just pure Emperor's Children, whereas important to remember on the first row of colours, none of those, where it's with the Xereus purple and the Fire Dragon Bright, none of those are pure colours. They're all mixed, just varying amounts. When it comes to the Emperor's Children and Xereus purple mix, it does actually go up to pure Emperor's Children at the top. But you can see on the video now that I'm filling in, applying the brain area. This is one of the reasons why I picked this model. Actually, I love the fact that it has like this massive brain just sitting exposed at the very top of the model, and it's got like this little symbiote creature stuck on top of it, like a little hat on top of his brain. But, you know, well, there's all sorts of reasons why we paint things on there, but you can see the paint colours I'm applying it. And so this is, remember, this is Xereus purple with a small amount of Emperor's Children. And when you apply this over the black, it's going to have really bad coverage. You're going to need probably at least 3 coats going over this. And again, use a larger brush. And when you are applying it, and hopefully you noticed when I was doing it as well, I was getting the paint right into the recesses, just cover the whole area. You want the paint to be quite opaque again when you've done it. So, you know, really slather the paint in. And don't worry too much about catching some of the other edges, because there's going to be quite a few layers of work on top of it. So if you catch a little bit like the purple carapace or whatever, it's not going to be a big issue. You know, try to be neat, but don't worry about it if you catch other things. Then at the far right on the wet palette, it's just Emperor's Children mixed with white, and then above that it's pure white, which in this case is Morrow White from P3. You don't have to use P3 paints. For the white anyway. I mean, it's pretty much the only P3 paint that I use, but I do like the P3 Morrow White as my preference, but you can use whatever white you want. So now I'm starting to add like the first highlight, if you like, to the bone sections on the model. And again, I'm sticking with the large brush, and remember this brush has no sharp tip on it. I actually find sometimes that having a large brush with like a very soft worn down tip is quite nice, because you get very what happens is you get like a large surface area contact when you do the mark, and it leaves very big soft marks on the model. So one, it covers the area very, very quickly, but also you never get any sort of like hard sharp marks when you actually make the, you know, put the brush on the model as well. So you can quickly get like soft, nice blending all over it. And you can see here as I'm painting the marks on, as I said, I'm covering the area very, very quickly, but I'm still looking for highlight placement now. So remember, this is a highlight stage. I'm not too worried about any of the texture work that's going to appear on there. And indeed, if you want to kind of like stop at this stage, say for example you're painting this as for an army and you've got to paint a load of these guys, then you know all that texture work and all the, you know, the nice highlights and things later on, that's too much really for doing this kind of painting for army painting standard anyway. And but you still want kind of like a little bit of interest on there and make the models look cool. You know, this first layer of highlight, just using the large brush, will you know, give something that looks interesting, creates a bit of definition, a bit of contrast on the model, but it, you know, it's not too much work, and you can get the marks down very quickly because of the large brush. So again, I'm just looking for the highlight placement to cover the area. I'm not being, you know, incredibly neat while I do this, because all of the, you know, the texture work that will work on top of it. In fact, if you're too neat when you do this and, you know, you're painting on all the lines already, what'll happen is that when you paint the texture marks on top, they will look too high contrast. Whereas if you have these big blocks of highlight as you apply them, you know, it gives you like you've already got like a lighter color there. So when you paint the extra details on top, it's still working as the highlight area without having like a really dark line in between each section of you know, scratchy mark making. Now I'm working on the kind of like the limbs of the model, and this is also the same for the tail and the underside a little bit, and I do actually end up painting the little guy that sits on his brain the same colour as well. This is also quite quick work. I changed my mind a little bit on how I paint we'll call this the skin area. So I changed my mind a little bit as I go along for how I paint the skin area. To start with, I am doing, you can see on the screen, some very quick blending. So again, it's Sotek green, and I've just added white for a few different sections. And again, if you want, you can do multiple mixes of this. So I've got obviously the 3 mixes, starting with just pure Sotek green at the bottom. But if you wanted to have like 4 or 5 variations getting lighter each time, it makes it a little bit easier when it comes to the blending. But also, like, that means there's a lot more layers. Which also means it's, you know, it's going to take more time, and it's not really that great if you're doing a lot of army painting. So I've started with 3, but I can always make more later if I decide that I need to refine it a bit more. But also because of the technique that I'm using with the larger sort of blunted brush, I can very quickly blend in these anyway, because it's just easier to do blending with a larger brush. Especially because the paint stays wetter longer on the model if you apply like a larger amount of it, but also you can like maintain some of the paint within the brush longer, and it's kind of like, you know, you paint on some of the model, then put the brush into the next highlight, and when you paint that on, because there's quite a large body of paint already in the brush, it will blend as you mix it more on the model. So you know, it's quite a quick technique, but it gives a very interesting and reasonably smooth effect with the blending. It's not going to be super detailed when you do it, but still at this stage that's not really that, you know, doesn't matter that much as long as it looks kind of like interesting with the highlight. I do later on start adding some stippling effect to the highlights on it, because I thought it just makes it, you know, when I'm doing these paintings I get kind of excited, and I'm like, oh, I want to put some texture work on. So you'll see the texture start to appear on the, you know, all the bone armor, and I'm like, oh, that looks good, so I want to put some more texture on, and I start doing all this stippling effect on the skin area, and the skin sort of looks interesting. So you have like the dots on the skin and the lines on the carapace armor, and you know, I was enjoying myself doing that, but it's just, again, it's really not suitable for army painting. But that, I mean, doesn't mean say you shouldn't pay attention to the technique, or if you enjoy it, you know, you want to use it maybe on the more important models within Tyranid army, or indeed just take the technique, or, you know, the style of painting that I'm using and apply it to whatever model you want. It doesn't have to be a Tyranid. You know, it's not, I think people get very focused on using paint recipes and colors for particular armies, but you shouldn't, you know, if you're watching a painting video, you don't want to limit yourself to be like, oh, that's how you paint that Tyranid, that color. You should be like, oh, that's a cool color, that's a cool technique, how can I use that on my painting? Because then it gives you a lot of options when you want to come and paint something and be, you know, make something up yourself. You can be like, oh, I've got such a broad range of ideas to work from, and I thought, oh, that thing on the Tyranid, or that thing on the Orc, or that thing on the Space Marine, that'll look really good when I paint this Eldari model. You know, so always take, you know, think about these kind of things. Don't just take painting videos as, and I know the videos are always titled how to paint this or how to paint that, but that's more for the algorithm. But you know, if you try and take it as a learning experience, or like a potential technique to use on other models, it's always, yeah, it'll just help you in your painting as you go along. One thing to note with the colours, so the Sotek green, as you add more white to it, the paint becomes a little bit more opaque, so it covers a bit better. If you find when you make the highlights with the lighter colours, they're a bit stronger when you put the brush down. If you find that maybe the mark is a little bit hard, or just stands out too much, you can go back with the previous colours, and if you go back to the Sotek green, it's really good for blending over the top, because it's quite a translucent colour, and good for glazing, and it just soften the, you know, the highlights a little bit, especially, you know, if you do it at the edges using the larger brush, you know, just kind of like feather at the edge of the highlight that's a bit strong, it'll blend in quite nicely. You can see at the moment I've now gone to an Artist Opus size 00 brush. Is really using these small brushes for army painting, like, so this, by this stage, if you ignore these highlights on the skin and you just do some quick highlights on the brain section and pick out a few bone bits, that would be perfect for an army painting piece. So maybe skip ahead on the video to see those bits, and that'll be fine. You paint 20 models like that for your unit, and I think they'll still look quite interesting on the battlefield. But the bits that I'm going to be kind of like painting from now on, they're more just fun painting things for me. Or, you know, if you want to do kind of like interesting textures and things on your model, or maybe if you're painting a kill team or something like that. Whatever it is, you know, it's going to be a more involved process, and you can see straight away that the marks that I'm making, they're much more, they're much smaller, they're more controlled, and a lot of that is because I'm using the smaller brush. Now, if you're using a larger brush, say like the size 2 that I was using before, you want to then swap over to a newer, larger brush. You can still paint the whole thing with a size 2 if you wanted, although I will say if you try and paint any of the inside sections on a model like this, with the limbs so close together, there's a strong chance you're going to catch edges that you don't really want to, because obviously a larger brush it's just wider, so you're more likely to catch parts that you don't want to. But you can still paint most of the model pretty well with a new size 2 brush, say, with a sharp point on it. But I just find painting all the texture work, it's easier with a thinner brush like this, like size 00, because I can push quite quick and quite hard, and it still makes a reasonably thin long line. Whereas if you push a little bit too hard with a larger brush, you're going to make a big mark. So I can very quickly rush through all these texture marks, and even though it'll look very detailed and like I've spent a long time doing it, by the end of the video I haven't actually spent that long, because I can make the marks quite quickly, and I just keep going over and over areas and things. So what I'm doing here, remember the colours I used, so this was Xereus purple mixed with Fire Dragon bright, but with this, by the time it gets to this, it's Fire Dragon bright, Xereus purple, and a little bit of white is added at this stage as well, so it's sort of like a kind of a peachy kind of colour. You can see above it, I think I mentioned before actually that I've got Ushabti bone as like the top highlight colour, but if you don't want to use Ushabti bone, you can just do the same mix again and just add a little bit more white to the this sort of like peachy colour, and it'll give a very similar effect anyway. But all I'm doing now is it's purely focused on texture work on the carapace. So the main trick to look for is looking at the flow of the armor. The main reason I picked this model to paint is because I just love the shape of the crown that goes around the brain section, and you can see it's got these really long sloping curves on there, and they sort of like flow in S shapes into it. Really nice to paint. Or just make the brush follow those shapes, but do it in a kind of like a rough way. So sometimes they go a little bit too high, a little bit too low. Doesn't matter if you catch different parts of the curves accidentally, because it all will add up to making that texture effect, because you just have to do lots and lots of them, and they will work together, and you kind of actually working against yourself if you try and make these too neat. So these want to be, like I say, kind of like scruffy but still small marks. So again, you want to be really ideally using a small brush to do this, because you can just do so many marks over and over again, being quite rough, to get them done quickly, and you don't have to worry about accidentally making a very fat mark when you do it, because if you actually paint a fat mark on when you do these thin marks, it's going to cover like quite a lot of the work that you've already done, so it sort of ruins it a little bit. But you can still work on top of that, but it just means it's harder to fix. So you always run that risk by using a larger brush, that you're going to make your life a little bit harder trying to achieve the same effect. While I'm still following all the flowing lines and things like that, if you've seen the photo of the final piece, there are highlight light volume blocks on this. Now that's not really added until the Ushabti bone, and I think I do actually take it up to white a little bit at the end. So it is more of a case of just still getting the textures down at this stage, and then you can highlight on top of them again afterwards. However, it is the case that if you're kind of like planning ahead for where the highlights are going to go, the big blocks of light volumes, that if you can try and make the lines a little bit more tightly packed in those areas, when you start going over with the Ushabti bone, it will just make your life a little bit easier again to sort of like block those in more strongly. And when I say block in, I mean like you're kind of like repeating the texture marks over and over, and it kind of fills in, but you can still see their lines at the same time. It'll make more sense as I go along, because it's kind of hard to explain, because if you're painting these lines all over each other, you kind of think, well, I'm going to be painting, if I paint too much the lines will vanish, and they kind of do a little bit on the very brightest parts of the highlight, but what you'll see is, so you can see there's still lines fairly strongly visible. And also what you'll find is sometimes you'll see a bit, and you can see on the carapace there that there's a couple of thin lines, and you can turn those into interesting detail. So those aren't sculpted on. That's just a case of me applying lots and lots of lines and then seeing a detail appear through the marks that I've made and then thinking, oh, that might be quite interesting, so I can push that a little bit more, or I can keep that within the final design. So you end up adding basically details that aren't sculpted on, but they look like they're part of the model, which I think it's quite cool anyway to do things like that. It's very interesting, though, that sort of painting. Another thing you can probably just about make out there is, sorry as well if you can hear a clinking sound in the background. I've got ice in my water. It's quite hot here, so I'm trying to keep cool. But if you look on in the middle of this sort of bone carapace section, there's quite a deep recess, but I've actually painted the lines within that recess, and so the temptation would be just to leave that as dark because you think, oh, it's a recess, it's going to be in shadow. But I've painted like the middle section, which you would think, oh, that's the darkest. But actually, when you hold that the model under a lamp, you'll see the light goes straight in there and highlights the back of it. So actually filling that in with the lines fills the area nicely. And if you imagine if that area was just dark, that would be a really big dark area within right in the center of the detail, and it would look kind of wrong and a little bit obnoxious really to see that big dark mark right in the center of all these like fine light bone textures. What you may have noticed as well while I've been painting some of these like kind of like peachy coloured lines on there is that I did go back to the previous highlight. So again, that would be Xereus purple with Fire Dragon Bright, and there's no white in that one. And I blended in some of the or went over some of the lines that you can see, but very delicately, and kind of it's just helping to sort of blend it in, but you're still doing the texture marks. So it's blending, but keeping the lines, and so you have to be a little bit careful when you do it, that you're not going to completely wipe out all the textures that you painted on. It is something to be aware of when you're doing these kind of texture marks, because what happens is you kind of like get into a mental state where you are like, okay, I'm painting, and you sort of almost like a trance. You're just doing these marks over and over, following the shapes and things, and like, oh, that's cool, blah blah blah. I've done it all over, and then you've done too much, and all the texture work starts to vanish because you've actually put so many lines down, and you've not really been paying attention to the position of them because you've got so many to do that you, like I say, you've just been doing it over and over, and you've actually lost the texture that you've applied there. So you do have to keep paying attention to what it is you're doing, just to make sure that you're maintaining that. Having said that, when you come up to the highlights for the Ushabti bone, it will, like I mentioned, sort of hide some of that texture a little bit, but the texture marks on the mid and dark areas on the bonework will still give the indication of all that texture work being all over, and it's just the light will be sort of covering the texture marks a little bit. So if you imagine like a strong light hitting a surface, the light gets into all the crevices and everything, and it hides the detail right where the spotlight is, and then you can see the details as it gets further away from the light source. So now you can see them up to the Ushabti bone, and the lighter that you get with each highlight stage, the more delicate and precise that you have to be with the marks. When I was doing like the lines with the peach colour and just doing that over and over, I was still being delicate and making sure that I was following the shape of the bone, the sculpting on it. But because you're doing so much of it, you can be a little bit kind of gung-ho with how you apply it. But by the time you're starting to use the Ushabti bone, you have to be much more careful with how you do it. Look very carefully at where the strongest light points are on the if you hold the model under the lamp, see where the light is shining most strongly on that part of the model. But also bear in mind that Ushabti bone is a very different colour to the other ones that you've already put on the carapace, and if you go really heavy with the Ushabti bone, you're going to lose a lot of the colour that you've already painted on, and it was quite intentional to get all those previous colours on there. So if you just go over it all, painting like lots of texture marks with a Ushabti bone going over the top of everything, it's just going to look like a generic sort of bone colour. in which case you may as well have not bothered mixing these colours yourself and just gone for some straight from the pot, because you could achieve the same texture mark with any colours, going from dark to light. And indeed that is the case. Like, if you don't like the colours that I'm using for this, don't feel like you have to use them to achieve the same effect. You can use whatever colours you want as long as it goes from dark to light, and you keep building up with each successive layers, doing more texture work, doing the same sort of strokes and lines and scratchy marks. You get the same effect with different colours. But it's nice to have these colours visible within the look of the carapace, and it's something also that other people will pick up on. They'll be like, "Oh, that looks interesting. Look at all those like subtle little colours in there. That's very different to how I normally see, bone painted. You don't see that kind of thing." But because it's like a fantasy creature, you can get away with kind of things like that because there's no set colour for them. But I mean, even if you're painting like realistic things, if you look at the way artists paint 2D things, not everything has to be like an exact copy. You can get watercolors, and people will use or imagine like there's a sunset or something like that, and it's got like some nice pinks and oranges or whatever hitting whatever creature it is that the sun's hitting, lighting up. So those colors are then part of the skin or fur or whatever it is of the creature that would be being lit. So you can see there now, going back to the skin colours, so the Sotek green mixed with white with successive layers, I've added another highlight, and I knocked back the one that's now one down from the top. You can see here where I'm going to start painting on this kind of like stipple effect. Now, as I mentioned, I do change my mind on how this is going to look. For a start off, I was spacing these dots out quite far, so this wasn't really a way to blend it. This is more to get like a pattern on the skin, and I thought I was kind of interesting, but then I thought I want to do some I want to blend the textures a little bit more together, so I did more dots on top of it, and then I changed my mind again, and so I go backwards and forwards, deciding on what I think will look better. At any stage, if you think you like the look of whatever technique I'm using and you like the result that it's getting, then keep that, because you can see there, so that the dots I think work quite well in combination with the lines of texture on the bone crown. But I don't know, I changed my mind. I'm just a little bit weird, I guess, with how I like to paint the things, and I just change my mind as I go along and think actually I want to paint in a different way. And what you see with the finished result is that the dots become much more closely packed together. It's sort of like it is more like traditional sort of stippling, using the stippling as a blending technique, but you can still separate the dots out, so you still get that texture effect. It's not just a smooth, perfectly blended finish. But also, if you do like a smooth, perfectly blended finish, that's also like a good combination, because you'll have the texture work of the bone against the very smooth skin. But it's just like about separating out all these surfaces, and it just depends which way you want to go when you do it. I think I probably went a little bit high on the highlights at this stage as well. So I was kind of thinking of like the aliens from the Aliens film, the Ridley Scott films, and the xenomorph. So they're not really speckled, but because they're so shiny, you get very harsh highlights on them, because they've got that sort of like glossy sort of coating, and so any highlight is like almost instant, going from white to the very dark color of their skin. And I kind of like that look, and because the skin that I'm painting on this was quite dark, I thought like very strong high contrast marks would be interesting on it. But I kind of feel like you get kind of, it works better with a very specific look of lighting and high contrast, and you really have to focus just on the lighting. And I think the way that I've highlighted the bone doesn't go that well with that look, so I change it as I go along. But just to talk about what I'm doing with the giant brain here, so again, this is Emperor's Children and Xereus Pebble, and again, it's like Xereus purple mixed with a small amount of Emperor's Children, and you can do as many variations of this mixture as you want. However, after you get to the pure Emperor's Children, which is the, sort of like the top right pink colour, you start adding white to the Emperor's Children colour, and you can take that as high as you want as well, because I'm going to glaze over the top of the brain, and it looks very purple at the minute. It's quite dull. This is definitely one area that I would do a little bit of work on, even if you're doing these as army painter pieces, because having the purpley kind of colour for the brain is kind of close to the green look of the body. So yeah, having that little bit more colour just separates it out a bit more. And also this model in particular, the Neurogaunt, I can't remember so it's like a node creature or something. It's the boss version of the Neurogaunt, so he's a little bit bigger than the other ones, and he's got this massive brain. I don't think the other ones are quite so big with their brains. And it's not going to be a big issue. It's not like you have to do this over and over for lots of different gaunts, but just for this particular model, it's just worth spending that tiny bit extra time just to do a couple of highlights, just to get that sort of pinky look in there. And then you'll see that later on I'll be glazing some red around the edges and in the recesses, and that will make quite a large difference to the overall look of this sort of pink area. And the way I'm painting this is, again, just you can kind of see, if you look towards the top left of the brain section, that the light from the lamp is hitting it, so you can see certain areas are lit up and other areas just look kind of like flat purple. Just pick out those areas that are catching the light, whichever of the highlight colours that you want. You can probably actually ignore the darker colours and just go straight in with the light pink. I did find that the Emperor's Children mixed with a small amount of Xereus purple, it makes a highlight, but it's something that probably, if you only want to do very smooth blends, is it worth doing? And by the time I glaze the Mephiston red on, that will hide the transitions if they're not perfect a little bit anyway, so it's just not really that necessary to use quite as many highlight colours as I started off using. But then as I get further along, I end up just using pretty much just purely the Emperor's Children colour, and then adding some white to it for the highlights, and it looks a little bit rough to start with, but then when you get, as I said, the Mephiston red glaze on it, it makes a big difference just to sort of fill it all in and help to blend it all together. One other thing is, so you can see here straight away I'm just going straight in with the Emperor's Children colour, and one other thing is that I paint a line, so kind of like an edge highlight going all the way around each kind of sausage shape of brain matter. So you can see what I mentioned, like holding it under the lamp shows you like the blocks of highlight like I'm painting in there, but also after doing that I go back in and I just sort of very quickly pick out all the edges with the Emperor's Children as well, so you get quite a strong edge highlight look to it, but that represents sort of bounce highlights, because I want the brain to look a little bit shiny looking, and having those bounce highlights everywhere because it's a curved surface, that makes sense. Normally I wouldn't edge highlight everything quite so strongly, but because of the shapes of them and the shininess of them, it does work and it makes sense when you actually look at it afterwards. So now going back to the carapace section, just going to paint in a few things just so you can see from different angles how to do it. The head section is one of the easier parts on the model, and you can see that I'm skipping out, not really skipping out because I guess I did it earlier, but I'm going straight in with the peach colour. So remember there was the Xereus purple mixed with Fire Dragon Bright, like a small amount of it, but you don't have to worry too much about that layer, whereas the head on this needs to be quite bright and shiny. It is tilted down a bit, so you're not going to paint it as bright maybe as you want to. It's hard to get it as a focal point, because even if you do paint it bright, when you look at it, like the natural light from your lamp or whatever doesn't quite catch it as much. But I do want to make the head nice and bright and like a strong focal point on the model. So I will be going over a lot of these lines quite a bit. So the first few lines, you can be extra rough with them because it's going to be a case of going over and over and over. Then when you get to the Ushabti bone and going up to white, that's when the detail, like the fine lines, will stand out a bit. So it kind of like you're almost just blocking in with this colour really. Also the front plate, the very front one that has got like the diamond head look to it, that will that's the most important one. All the other ones, as they fade further back, you're just carrying on the lines pretty much, but they don't have to be anywhere near as neat. Also on the front section, because they're quite small, each successive layer of armor plating, I do pick out the edge highlights going around on these as well, because what will happen is with all these lines on them, and the best way is always like a draw mark towards you, so you're pulling the brush towards you. That's why I had it upside down, but when you do lots of those marks over and over, it kind of leaves like a feathered edge, so it's not a very distinct edge right where all those lines stop, and it looks very broken, and you lose the shape of the armor plate a bit. So that's why I'm going back in, and I tilted the model round again so I can just run the edge of the brush down those the edges of the armor plate, just to get like an edge highlight in there, just to define the shape of it a bit more, because it does get lost as you add all these extra lines on. So now I'm going to be adding the Ushabti bone. This is as I said, this has to be a little bit stronger on the top section here than the other parts of the bone armor, the carapace armor, just to get the strong bright highlights on it. Try not to go too far down to the sides, because you still want to get some of that colour in there. You still want it to match the rest of the bone armour on the model, but don't worry about it too much, because you do have to look at models as a whole when you're painting them. So it's not like highlights are not taken to the same brightness or shadow or whatever equally all over a model if you're painting with light volumes, because some things will naturally just be lighter because the light is hitting them more, and other areas will be naturally darker because they're in the shadow and there's not a lot of light hitting them. And you're relying kind of like on the mid-tone areas to show off the colours, whereas like as you go more into the shadow, the sort of like the colours become more desaturated. You might be adding black to it or whatever it is, but you're taking away the colour. Same for the highlights. So even if I wasn't using a Ushabti bone, if I just carried on using Fire Dragon Bright mixed with Xereus Purple, but added more white to it, the more white that I add is still desaturating the colour, so it still eventually will end up as a white or an off-white colour. And then again, you don't get to see the orange and purple that you'd already put on there as you go over the layers. But you can see, as I've been highlighting the layers up, as it got brighter and brighter, I start picking out other raised ridges on the armour, just so that you can still see some of that texture work on there. So now, just very quickly, I'm just showing you adding the Mephiston red around the edges of the brain, and you do this all over. So ideally, finish painting the brain. I've just rushed this small section to give you an idea on how to do it. The red on the wet palette, as I said, Mephiston red is very heavily watered down. It's around about 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and it's supposed to be a glaze, but I'm not rubbing the excess off of the brush like I normally would. The reason for that is because I want to get it all running within the recesses, and like the natural surface tension will just kind of like pull the paint in there, and it looks very kind of messy while it's wet, but when it dries it'll all it becomes more matte. It looks a lot neater, so don't worry too much if you think, oh, I'm messing this up as I apply that. Also, just ignore the little legs on the chap sitting on top of his brain, because it's easier to ignore those and then paint them in afterwards, rather than keep trying to paint around them all the time. Then here you can see I am kind of like glazing from like the mid sections of each part of brain matter, then going towards the edge and the recess. And here you can see it more as it's dried out, it becomes a lot softer. So when you're applying it while it's red, while it's wet, it looks quite strong red, but because it's so watered down, once it dries, it's a much softer, and it just becomes a bit more pinky, a bit more red, the pink on it. And so you can see there's a big difference there between the sort of like the purpley look of the brain matter where I haven't finished painting it, and the section where I have, where I've been, highlighted it up through the Emperor's Children, adding white, and then going over it again with the Mephiston red. So now back to another part of the carapace, and I thought it'd just be interesting to show you like this. This is the easiest part to paint on the carapace because you've got full access with the brush, and it's just very quick and easy just to do lots and lots. And these are the draw marks I was talking about, pulling the brush towards you. There's a little bit of fluctuation in the shape, like the curve at the side, the right hand side there, it just curves round a little bit. So as you're going to apply the texture on that, that'll be a little bit lighter, and it's just a case of, again, using that sort of peach colour that you mix, going over and over and over it. And because this area is a little bit in shade more than the top section, so you can see the bit that sticks out like just above his bum, I went in the centre of there with the Ushabti bone, and I can't, maybe a little bit of white, but not too much, right in the centre. That's again where, if you hold the model under a lamp, you'll see that's where the light hits it, because it's in that nice curve section. And then it gets a bit darker on either side of that, but then this bit on the tail, it's underneath that. It's not really in shadow, but because it's a bit lower down, you don't want to take the highlights quite as light on that, because that then means that the highlights on the bony ridge above that, they stay bright and more of a focal point. And again, it's a tricky thing to get just right when you're looking at adding highlights, because the temptation is always to highlight everything up to the same brightness, because what you feel is that you haven't finished painting the model by not taking everything up to the same brightness. So you think, oh, I've only taken this up to that colour, whereas that section over there, that's taken up to pure white. So if I haven't painted this up to pure white, I haven't finished painting it. But actually, if you do take it up to pure white, the bits that you'd already painted pure white then become less impactful, and nothing looks bright, and there's no real focus to it. Whereas by keeping this area dark and just sticking with the Ushabti bone on just the brightest parts of it, it means that, one, you can still see a lot more of the colour that's in the carapace armour anyway, and it also allows the focus to stay on the bright parts, and it creates more variation on the model, which I think just makes it look more interesting. You don't really want to paint everything to the same brightness all the time, because then everything's the same. It's not interesting to look around the model. Once you've looked at one part of it, that's it, you've seen the whole thing basically. So you can see there I'm just focusing right on the very top section, because that's closest to the brightest part on the curve of the sticky out bit on his bum. But again, I'm using those draw marks, pulling the brush towards you, because that gives you the most control, and it's the easiest mark to do as well. Like, you're not going to go too wrong, and I think most people should be able to achieve like a really nice textured finish with that, even if you don't have steady hands or whatever. The movement is very mechanical, just going over and over, and you should be able to do something quite similar as long as you have a bit of practice with the getting the right amount of paint on the brush. That is something that is important though, that the correct amount of paint on the brush. So you obviously you take the paint from the wet palette, apply it to the brush. The brush is now overloaded, and you need to take off the excess paint by either. So what I do is I rub it along my thumb, or you can drag it along the palette that you're using. Now, because of the way I set out my palette, that's not as easy for me, because I'll be dragging it through the other colours. But if you've got like a spare area on your palette, or you've got like a tile, or even a bit of kitchen roll, just rub off the excess, and you should end up with like a sharp point on the tip of your brush. And now you have like a limited amount of time to finish getting the paint onto the model, because while you've been doing that, the paint's been drying. The good thing is, if you put it on I know some people use a thumbnail even, when you do take off the excess, you can see how the paint flows, so it gives you a good indication of, will the paint leave the brush and adhere to the model in a nice smooth motion. That's the main thing you'll see. And because the draw movement is so obvious on the model, you do the same movement when you're dragging it over your thumb, you can very quickly see if that mark is going to achieve the same effect when you apply it on the model. So going back to the skin here, and you can see now I'm going back and I'm adding a lot more dots and getting that kind of like stipply sort of effect. And as I mentioned, it's entirely up to you if you want to go for the same sort of look. What I do find though is, even though this is more time consuming, so again maybe not suitable for an army that's you need hundreds of models on the board for, the effect itself I think is a little bit easier to achieve to look neat. Whereas the other ones where you're putting the dots on, and the dots are spaced out and they're very obvious, each individual dot you can see quite clearly, and when you do that, the dot has to be perfect, because if it's a wonky looking dot, it'll stand out and people will be like, oh, that's not painted as neatly as it could be. Whereas when I've been painting the carapace on it, you can see like all those lines, like none of those lines are particularly neat when I've been doing them, but they look great all built up together. And it's kind of like a similar thing while painting the dots on the skin here. Each individual dot might not be amazing, but when you do lots of them built up, then they work really, really nicely together. But if they're all like left on their own, like floating in the dark area of the skin, you'll very quickly see if they are well painted or not. And you can see that I'm going back a bit. If you remember earlier on in the video when I was talking about using the large brush, so again you can see this is now the size 2 Artist Opus brush, and the tip is completely worn out, so it's like a very soft tip on it. And I'm going over like some of the stippled areas, and I'm using the darker colour. So it does have a small amount of white in it. It's just one above, using Sotek green straight from the pot, but it just blends over very nicely from the dots you've made on there, and it won't wipe them out because it's quite a translucent colour, but by going over them, it sort of knocks them back, makes them look a lot softer, and then you have that, like you can see the texture, but it's more subtle. But also, like, I got a little bit bored doing it, and again I was trying to get this painted for a Warhammer community article, so I just kind of like start blocking in some of these highlights a little bit on the legs and things. I was running short of time, so that's also why you'll see like the base suddenly gets done very quickly. Just to talk about the base, very, very simple. All I did was cover it in PVA glue, put sand all over it, then put more PVA glue on, more sand. So it's like in certain areas, because this particular model, he has like some big blocks that he's standing on. You can see on his back foot there, he's got like a little bit of rock sticking out, but also the front foot has the same, and I didn't want to paint that, so I just loaded up sand and PVA around there. Then I used a hairdryer to kind of like speed up the process a little bit, but also I did, while the sand was all over it, watered down some PVA and gave it a coat all over as well, so the base is very wet. It does make the sand sort of like all mushes together a bit, but having that layer of PVA, watered down PVA over the top, means that the sand won't come off. Like when I dry brush it at the end, it's all very, very solid, which is ideal for army painting stuff. Like, so you can pick the base up and you don't have to worry about it knocking off. But what I do find, or I used to find anyway before I'd put that layer of PVA on, when I tried to dry brush the base, you're knocking sand off all the time, because it's you've glued it on, but the sand sort of like clumps together a little bit, and there'll be particles of sand that are closer to the PVA than other parts, and those bits that are higher up and further away, they get knocked off when you try and dry brush on top of it. So putting the watered down PVA over the top, it makes everything stick really hard to the base, and you never knock anything off when it comes around to dry brushing it. So I do that all the time now. And then all I did from here was I covered the base in Skeleton Horde contrast paint, and then a quick dry brush of, I think actually I used the peachy colour that I'd mixed up, just to do a very, very quick and dirty dry brush on it, and that's all I did. So I didn't even paint the sand as such, it's just letting the wash do the work, and then a quick dry brush on top of it, so not even any primer or anything like that on it. But you can, as I've been talking about the base there, you can see I've just been doing a little bit more work on the skin, a bit more stippling, but slightly messy stippling, keeping the texture work on there. But the main thing is really it's just like the contrast and the light volumes that are doing all the work. It's not the neatest thing you'll ever see in terms of painting, but if you wanted to spend more time on it and get something that looked like golden demon quality or whatever, you can do that. You can use all these techniques I've used on this and just spend a long time doing them, make it look super neat, and it'll look kind of like this but better. One other thing just to point out while I'm quickly doing all these other bits is, so if you look on the bone crown around the the big brain area, if you look at the edges of those, so like the underside bit, I've painted those in as well, and those don't have any textured section like from the sculpt, so again you have to do the same thing. And what I've done is I've carried on the shape of the lines that I've painted on, so you can see on the bit that sticks out near his butt, you paint the it's like basically lots of horizontal lines that end there, and then you just paint them curving round the end, and the same on the bits that point downwards. And you don't have to be extra neat with how you do it, because again it's getting that sort of like textured look on the bony armor, but as long as you get the direction of those lines right, I think it looks pretty cool. This area I mess up a little bit on this, to be honest, because I was trying to do it quick. I was literally out of time when I was painting it. So I'm painting all of the claws with XV88, and so I'm using the large brush to cover the surface area pretty quickly, and that's great because you don't get lots of marks. I was trying to separate out the look of them, but what also happens is when you use a larger brush, it doesn't give as thick a layer of paint because I've watered it down a bit. Like if I'd spent a little bit more time and stuff and just got it just right, I probably would have done better, but it kind of like it is what it is. But I've very quickly covered all of the claws and hooves and things like that, and then I thought because just to get it done, I thought I'd do some more texture on them. So this is actually very similar to the way that I do the bone armor. I was kind of thinking maybe I should just actually paint it the same way, the same colors, but it's so actually, if you remember earlier on, I said, you can use any colors you want. I thought, okay, well, I'll pick different colors and do a similar sort of thing. And so this is going to be XV88, Balor Brown, and I think it's either Morghast bone or a Ushabti bone. It doesn't matter too much. It might actually be a Ushabti bone. No, it's clearly it's got to be Morghast bone, because you can see I've got a Ushabti bone there on the left, so that's lighter. So this is Morghast bone. And all I'm doing is same thing again. These are draw strokes going down. What you'll find though is if you've rather foolishly glued the model to the base, and the only reason I did this is because I needed the base to be dry by the time I was going to take the photo. But if you've glued the model to the base with the sand on, you'll find that you can't do the draw stroke completely neatly, because you're going to hit the bottom of the base all the time with the stroke. But the idea is that as you want it lighter at the top section of the hoof, and then it gets darker as it gets further down, which is actually a problem, because ideally to do that kind of mark you would be pulling the brush and doing the marks in the opposite direction, because it's you usually paint towards a highlight point, so you'd start around about 2/3 of the way down and then paint up and finish right next to the ankle area, or just the little blue line bit. You paint up towards that, and then you would stop, and then you get like a nice transition with the paint mark as you made it. But I couldn't do that, because then I'd be hitting the the blue line, but also because I'm trying to paint it so you can see what I'm doing. If I was painting this and I wasn't recording it, I probably would have the model upside down, but it just wasn't good for the video. But I kind of made it work anyway. So you can see here, so I've been now through XV88, Balor Brown, Morghast bone, and now up to a Ushabti bone right at the very top. And again, very similar to how I did all the texture work on the other armor plates. You can see there a little bit, I'm trying to push it towards the top, but again I'm rushing it, so it's not going super neat, but it's the feet of the model. I say this a bit, but no one cares what the feet look like. Everyone's going to be like, oh look, the bone armor, that looks nice, or the brainy bit, that's nice, or I've had a few comments from people liking the little chap sat on his brain. No one said, oh look at the feet. And here you can see I've watered down some Mournfang brown, and there's also some Rhinox hide, and then I've gone back in with a large brush and just making the tip of the hoof a little bit darker with a glaze. You could do this if you want. you probably want to do it a little bit neater than I am, but the idea is that you're sort of going around about halfway along the edge and then dragging it to the bottom. And then if you want, you can go in with some Rhinox hide as well to make the tip very dark. Now, I wasn't intending to do this too much on the hoof, but on the claws from his hands, and I probably kind of should have done that more as a focus than the hoof, but I just wanted to show the idea anyway. If you so you're doing the same sort of thing, but a little bit further down on the model, a little bit, take your time a little bit more than I'm doing, but you get a nice transition. The textures should still be visible on there, but it's like nice and dark right at the base, so that then separates the hooves and the claws and things out quite strongly from the bone armor everywhere else on the model. So because I messed that up a little bit off camera, I do end up tweaking it a little bit to just go over it and make the texture more visible again. So there you go. You see I've just done the same thing, same on the claws and the little hooks on him and all those kind of little bits. Same colours actually on the teeth as well, but just very simple quick lines, and you can see how the base has already been dry brushed with the same colour as the peachy colour that we used on the bone armour, even though it doesn't look it because it's got the Ushabti bone on it and it's also got the purple colours on it, so it actually separates it out, and that's again a good like showcase for how you can use very similar colours, but having different base colours makes a huge difference to the final look of the colour that you're using. But there we are, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I think that's going to be all I'm doing for Leviathan. I might do another Marine depending on how I feel and how much time I have, but don't forget that I have my Patreon and my website where I have like a lot of things, and the painting is more focused towards like Golden Demon style entries and high level stuff. So I'm painting like Dante on there and a few other pieces, so if you fancy that kind of thing, please go and have a look. But thank you for watching the video, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.